Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and I am the host of this podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I am also a newly minted USA Today best-selling author of the novel Blank. I've created a whole community of book lovers around this podcast, a publishing company, reading retreats, a bookstore, and more. Learn more at zibbymedia.com or follow me on social at Zibby Owens or join the community at Zibby Readers. Lisa Keefauver is the author of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss. She is a social worker, grief activist, and founder of Reimagining Grief. Lisa is an adjunct professor of loss and grief at the University of Texas at Austin, an organizational consultant, and a keynote speaker, including at TEDx. In 2019, she created the popular podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss. Thank you.
I'm having a little surreal out-of-body moment being on this side of the microphone and being in conversation with you. So thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. Yeah. First of all, I feel like we should preface the episode with the same thing that you preface the book with, which is this sort of non-gendered, bitch announcement. You're not, so maybe you should talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, I recognize that it has a gendered name in our culture. And as you mentioned in conversation with my publisher, I thought, we'll put a note up front. This is really about the ways in which I'm calling out our culture around our false narratives about what grief really is and the way it can be sneaky and sort of reclaiming it and owning it. And so that we can understand a little bit better how to navigate grief. So this is not a gendered slam or slur. This is really a reclaiming of we're going to name what grief is really like and go from there. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, sad to say that your book comes from a very personal place, which you write about, obviously, in the book. And I'm so sorry for your loss. And I'm very grateful for you going deep into it and telling us sort of the moment by moment of what the experience of losing your husband was like. And I was hoping you could share a little bit about that. I always hate to do this to people I talk to about grief, where it's like a beautiful day out and whatever. And I'd like you to go to your deepest, darkest, most horrific moment of your entire life. Go there. So I'm sorry.
No. Well, I appreciate the acknowledgement, but also, first of all, there's never a day, it's been almost 13 years since Eric died, that I don't relish an opportunity to talk about Eric. So I welcome that. And I think most grievers would say the same. Yes. And I'll tell you a little bit about the book is definitely written for grievers and educating grievers. It is not a memoir, but I knew very clearly from the beginning that I needed to weave in a little bit of not just my professional training as a social worker, but my personal narrative too, to sort of my bona fides, if you were, as it were. So 40 years old, I was married to the love of my life. We had a 7-year-old daughter, and the year before he ended up dying in my arms, he began to become a completely different person. And I won't go into the details, but he went from being the most loving, most involved co-parent, co-household manager, carry a spider outdoors, instead of killing it kind of guy, to becoming, and a geographer, to becoming getting lost, going places, physically looking unlike anything he had ever looked like before, becoming frankly quite dangerous and scary, and just our lives turn upside down, from doctor to doctor to doctor, no answers, being dismissed, being told he had a mental health issue, only to discover after a year of surviving, living in a household with a stranger, making safety plans, trying to figure out what was happening in our lives. I got a call to come into the ER because they had finally, after a year, managed to do a scan, and it turned out he had a grapefruit-sized brain tumor that had shifted his brainstem. And I can still remember to this day the ER doctor, as neurologist, had come down and looked at us both and said, "I literally don't understand how you're walking or talking. It has shifted your brainstem in such a way that's impossible." And a few days at home, passing our 9-year wedding anniversary, he had a 13-hour surgery. The goal was, he's probably not going to survive this, but we're going to have some time. We're going to reduce this tumor. We're going to figure out what's next, kind of. And after a 13-hour surgery, and thank God they let me into post-op, seeing him, went home at 3 a.m. to check on my daughter. Friends, family were there. Came back to the hospital 3 hours later, no sleep, and he had slipped into a coma. and another 14-hour surgery and all kinds of interventions for the next week. And they discerned that he had a series of catastrophic strokes that were, he was never going to wake up. And so I found myself calling in everybody, including bringing my daughter into the hospital to say goodbye to her dad at 7 years old. I had them take out all the leads and, his face, everything was swollen, obviously, from brain surgery, and try to make him look the least scary version of himself he could. And then laid in bed with him for about 9 hours until he died in my arms. And then he took his last breath, and I somehow took my first breath without him. And I stood up and I went home and I told our 7-year-old daughter that her dad was dead. Still, like I said, it'll be 13 years this August, and I've experienced other losses since, and obviously been witness to so many other people's losses in my work. And it still sometimes feels like I'm telling a story of somebody else's life, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Oh.
So that's how I arrived. That's one of the ways in which I arrived here to be doing this work and so passionate about my work as a grief activist. Yeah.
I'm so sorry for everything you went through. When you wrote about it in the book, you described sort of the moment of being in bed with him. I feel like you said you were there for 9 hours.
Yeah. I think they took his life, they took him off life support around 8, 9 in the evening, and he died around 6 in the morning. So I just laid there and absorbed every freckle and relived the 12 years we had together. And the sneaky thing, so many sneaky things about grief and loss, is Eric was our memory keeper. He had the memory of a vault, and I have the memory of a sieve. And so I really spent that time trying to record everything about his physical experience, about what he didn't smell great. We're in the hospital, but like what he felt like, telling the stories to just try to like lock it in my brain, because I knew I wouldn't, like he's always the person I went to be like, where did we travel? And what was that restaurant? And what movie did we watch? And so that was that experience. I tried to write a little detail about that. Yeah.
Oh, so terrible. I'm so sorry. I also find it a crime that nobody diagnosed it earlier when he was clearly symptomatic. I just can't even, the healthcare system is so broken for that to have happened. So
I just finished treatment for breast cancer, thankfully, and I'm so grateful to see that I'm clear. And I was misdiagnosed for a year. I went from doctor to doctor with a lump, had mammograms, had exams, was told it was nothing.
How is this possible? What is
triple positive breast cancer? I was like, did I do something in a past life? Like, what is happening here?
Oh my God.
I'm okay. And I'm so grateful to say at this moment, I'm cancer free. And I just have so much gratitude for this moment, but everybody's loss is profound and complex in their own way. I do think, and I was just saying this to somebody else, the ambiguous loss that I experienced in that year when Eric was physically present, but he wasn't him, but we didn't know why. That took me years to really come to process. Like I was processing his death loss as well as can be expected in a grief illiterate world, and all the things that I was having to do. But I think it really took me a couple years into my grief when I really had to like own and name and process the ambiguous loss that it means. And for folks listening, if you have somebody in your life with dementia or Alzheimer's or addiction where someone is physically present but not themselves, that's such a profound loss that we don't name. And then, so.
Could he tell that he was changing or not?
No, and that was what made things really sticky. I would say something to you and he would get really aggravated and just talk about like, this is really who I am. And, he would sort of, right when in that small window of time. So July 29th was when we were in the ER, and August 16th was when he died in my arms. So I'm literally talking 2.5 weeks. In the 4 days or 5, like in the week, basically, we ended up, after they discharged him, to come home for a couple days before he went in for that first surgery. They gave him some medications that helped reduce the swelling and the imprint on his brain. And in that little window, he was, we recognized what had been going on. We made amends with each other. We talked about thank God we had some advanced care directive conversations so that I wasn't making a decision that I didn't know. So there was that little window where he was well enough and medicated enough where I think he could understand. I don't think he understood fully the impact, but he got, So, there's some relief for me a little that he could come to grips with why things had become the way they had. It had just become a very scary I mean, I was making like safety plans, it was just like just a surreal 360. I don't know what the description is there, but he did know, I think, in the end. And we had a little pocket of window to tell each other we love each other and to make amends and to begin to grapple with why our lives had been the way they had been. So, yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, in the book, you do a really painful, great emotional job of describing grief. And the passage that resonated with me kind of the most is this confusion in the immediate aftermath of a loss, where like, how is the world still going on? Like, I don't think I dug
I
it.
think it's the world still spinning.
Yeah,
the
and like
world is still
how is the key still opening the door? And how is someone worried about, a line or what? It's just like all the things that people talk about and do in life. And you're just like, but the world to me, the universe must have changed because my universe changed so much, and yet it doesn't. So
Yeah.
tell me about, and I also feel like when people are grieving and when they are feeling like that, there's nothing that will change or make that better. Like you can't anticipate how crazy it will feel, right? And you can't,
Yeah.
when you're in it, reassure someone that it will pass because it feels like it will never pass. So it's just sort of awareness and making sure that you know also that other people are going through those feelings at the beginning as well.
Yeah, I think normalizing it, which is what I try to do throughout the book, particularly when I explore the chapter around what happens to our grieving brain, which is
Yes.
part of why we feel crazy, but also just, you know, this is a shock. Our bodies go into shock, and we basically are in a chronic stressor state. And so, of course, everything feels crazy and overwhelming. And I offer this manuscript. Our lives are built by the stories we tell of our experiences, and a death loss or some other catastrophic loss is akin to the manuscript of our lives being torn to shreds and then handed back to us with no instructions on how to live our lives. So, of course, we feel lost and disoriented. There's physiological, neurological effects going on our brain. And to your point, yes, to an early griever, you can't necessarily convince them, but I didn't have anyone in my life. And remember, I was a clinical social worker. No one around me knew anything about grief. Like we didn't talk about it, we didn't understand it. And so while the book may not be able to convince a griever that it will end or that it's normal, they're happening. I try to do in the book, walking through different examples of why it's happening, why it's temporary, the things that you can do to help sort of mitigate against the brain fog and the grief brain and all of those things. But yeah, the world is still spinning and people are still complaining about traffic and their husbands. And, I mean, literally like planes are flying overhead. I was like, how are planes flying overhead? And how does the door, yes, as you said, how does the key unlock the door that Eric's never going to walk through again? I've never met a griever in my entire career who hasn't had that experience of disorientation and the world being sort of ripped out from underneath them. And good news, I've never met a griever over time who hasn't found their bearings again and who hasn't found some stability underneath them and found that the world does not feel like such a spinning topsy-turvy place. And
Well,
it just takes time.
it's almost a reluctant stability. Like you don't want the
Yes.
new world. You don't want the new normal.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a weird thing. This happens in fits and starts for people in different ways. It's like when you have that first moment of laughter, which I remember having, or that first moment of normal or stability, it's like a good news, bad news scenario. It's like, thank God, because how can you withstand a life that feels so upside down? And guilt or shame, or I don't want to be happy with a life without my person, if we're talking about a death loss. It's that both and of those moments. And we have that so much in life and especially in grief. I think I refer in the book to smiling, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're smiling because something amazing happens, but crying because your person isn't here to tell them about it.
Yeah.
That feels to me the ultimate reminder of the ways in which when the world stops spinning, we are grateful and yet sorrowful all at the same time that it's not spinning in that way anymore. Yeah.
Gosh. What do you tell patients or You call them patients, right?
Clients,
Clients,
yeah.
clients.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
knew that didn't sound right.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
What do you tell clients about sort of place-based grief, or like places that trigger your grief, or that some like like if you were to go into that same hospital again,
Yes.
or a car ride, or just something
Yes.
like we all have those moments. Like, how do you sort of clear the air, barring crystals or smelling? You know what I mean? Like, what do
I
you?
mean,
How can you do it?
if you have rituals that you believe in, spiritual rituals or religious rituals, I really am a big believer in rituals, just as a side note, and really wish that I had grown up in a family that had more. I grew up in a non-religious, non-spiritual family, that I had more of those to rely on, because I think they are meaningful in the way that they ground us when the world feels so spinny. But when we're thinking about, and this will depend on how far we are away from the loss, but when we're talking about what you're calling of triggers, like place-based triggers, it's the car or the hospital. Sometimes, by the way, the triggers are smells, songs,
Yep.
sounds, movies. I mean, the thing is, they're part of why grief is a sneaky bitch is, they can pop up anywhere. To the degree that we know we're going to having to be going to a family reunion at the house, or we're, to the degree we know you might be encountering a trigger, I would say sort of make a plan, sort of remind yourself that you might be triggered. What is your escape plan? Same with like holidays, can you find a buddy to call? Like what kind of space can you allow yourself? Can you notify somebody, I might just need to, peace out, and that's what's going to happen. So gifting yourself the permission, or finding a friend who's say like, you're going to have to just hold me because I'm probably going to cry. Right. And also making space for that, and not trying to put on a happy face. For the things that pop up when you're in a coffee shop and a song comes on that was never played on the radio, but is your song and somehow is playing, which has happened to me so many times over these last 13 years, you give yourself grace and space. I think the best thing I can say to somebody, so much of our harm and grief, or is all the shoulding we do all over ourselves, the ways we should and shouldn't ourselves. So when those triggers come up and if you're driving, pull over, be safe, right? If you're in a coffee shop and you don't want to cry in front of people, although I say cry in front of people, if that's what comes up for you, go to the bathroom, excuse yourself, do your best to name it. This is a trigger. This is what's happening. It's going to pass, because no feeling in the history of the world has ever lasted. Not the ones we want, not joy and delight and amazement. Gosh darn it, I wish we could hold on. And not sorrow or despair or shame. And so the more we grip or resist, the longer it's going to stay. So when those triggers come, and you maybe can't avoid it because you can't not go to those places or hear that music or see that movie, do your best to release that resistance and allow it to pass through, because it will. And the more we do that, that's how we metabolize our grief. The more we resist or shove it down, the more it lingers and hangs around in its sort of raw and unprocessed form, and the more it sort of harms us over time. I also just want to name, like, sometimes you're at work. Like, I got called back to work 2 weeks after my husband died. And that was like luxurious for a lot of people to have less time. So, sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't be with the trigger. You're in a meeting, or, you don't have that luxury. So just make sure that if you have to hold it together and you pinch your cheeks or do whatever you have to do to get back in the room, that later on you make space. Later on in the day, later on the next week, let that out, discharge that experience. So I just want to name, like, we can't all just be like, you might be interviewing somebody on a podcast, or you might be doing something official where you can't be with it, but just make sure you process that trigger at some point. Yeah.
Has your own podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, helped you with the processing? And I know you've had on such amazing guests, and, what have you sort of taken away from their experiences?
I really have. I know you get this because you do this. Like, every time I have a guest on, I learn one or two or 12 things, just sort of at the intellectual level, but also about my own grief, about how I show up for other people's. I mean, I don't have as many episodes as you, but 90 something guests, it's hard to pick them all out. I mean, one that's been standing out to me recently, this from last season, was my conversation with Colin Campbell, who you've probably met, who wrote Finding the Words, in part because his reliance on ritual was so profoundly important to his own and his wife's own experience of grief. It really, again, almost 12, 13 years after my Eric's death, got me thinking differently about how I might incorporate ritual in my own grief, especially because I've been going through new waves of grief through my own cancer diagnosis and everything that has come as a result of that. So I think that is a guess, but everybody's wisdom, their shared stories, their vulnerability, the connection that we gain when we are vulnerable with one another. It's all been, I don't know, it's a weird metaphor popping in my mind, like fertile soil for my own grief and the metabolizing of my own grief, but also fertile soil for how I show up for other people. Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
So how often do you do it? Weekly or?
Yeah, this last season I did it weekly, and I actually recorded my podcast all the way through my cancer treatment. So I was showing up on video bald with sores on my head. There was a week I had no eyebrows and no eyelashes, and it was a real circus. But the reason I did it is these conversations are so important about grief. And we never know what gifts and connections and sense of belonging we're going to have when we're in conversation in general, but particularly around the hard things that we tend not to talk about. And everything about who I was, which happens in all kinds of losses. We lose not just our person if it's a death loss, but we lose our own identity and who we are in the world. And with cancer and breast cancer in particular, I mean, losing a breast and hair and all the things, and chemo brain is real, let me tell you. The podcast and those intimate conversations were about the only thing that made me feel like me. And I could anchor back to that where we started with the spinning world. Like I could anchor myself in the world in a way because it was like, oh, this is what I'm meant to be doing. This is where I get to show up as the Lisa I've always known, even if all these, external things don't look at all like the Lisa that I knew. And that's been, I mean, the show is just one of the biggest gifts in my life. Yeah, for sure.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Oh, good for you for not stopping. As you were talking, I was like, if I was going through cancer treatment, would I stop podcasting? Probably not. Do you know, like,
right? I mean, it's
you have to keep your job. Like you have to do your, to the extent that you can keep anything the same when something terrible is going on, that's always helpful.
And I want to give permission because I do think, and I talk about this a lot in the book, sort of our cultural baggage that we take into our grief, productivity and capitalism and all the crap that makes grief even harder and causes us to suffer unnecessary. So I don't want to, sort of be braggy about like, I kept working and doing the podcast.
No. I didn't take it that way.
And I didn't, like, there are plenty of other things I set down, but I really had to take and this is I talk about this a lot in the book too, and this is an invitation to anybody listening who's grieving, is like, it's an invitation periodically, sometimes hourly, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, when you're in the depths of despair, of grief, to like evaluate what resources me and what drains me. And the answer to those questions are going to vary sometimes hour by hour or minute by minute. When you're, especially when you're in the early phase of grief, and for me. And so, early on in my treatment course, I mean, I went and gave a TED Talk between diagnosis and starting the surgery. But as I was, going through, I just kept booking guests, but I had to check in, weekly with myself. Like, can I really do this? I stopped teaching my university course the following semester. There were other things I set down, but I really this is the invitation I talk about throughout the book. And I really tried to offer invitational languages. When we're laid low by something like loss, a profound loss, I'm not going to use the word gift, but it is an opportunity or a reminder to really realign with our values, to check in with our needs, to figure out where we resource ourselves and what are the resources, and to give ourselves the permission that can change over time. And that isn't a sign of failure or weakness. And actually, the more we resource ourselves in the way we need to, which sometimes means doing the work, and sometimes it means not doing the work, the more capacity and agency we have, and the more bandwidth that we have to do the hard work of metabolizing loss. And yeah, so for me, it was the right answer this time around, and that particular piece of my work. But there was plenty, believe me, that I set down.
Yeah. No, and I didn't mean to say like full productivity ahead. I meant because like you, I get so much joy and I get so much out of the conversations. It's purely selfish. I would hate to give it up.
Exactly. I was like, no, I need to be. And cancer journey, much like grief, is a very inherently isolating experience. And so being in conversation on the podcast was like one of the ways I felt not just tethered to my own identity, but tethered to the world.
Yep.
Because my whole life was just doctor's appointments and chemo chairs and radiation appointments, other than that.
I feel like you have joined, there's like this grief expert community, right? You're all, I don't think people understand how close different grief counselors are, and that there is this whole group of you who is lifting each other up. And yes, many of you have books and many of you have podcasts, but you are all in service to everybody else. You're like the grief angels or something.
Oh, I appreciate that. I feel so grateful to have that community because I didn't have that in the early years of my loss. I didn't know another widow for a long time, my age. But yeah, we lift each other up and of course support our work. But, Megan, of course, and Claire Bidwell Smith and all those folks, I think we just also show up for each other in a knowing way. Like, I see you, I got you, whether it's like an anniversary or whatever is happening. I'm beyond grateful for my community of grievers and grief experts. And to be a part of that is kind of a pinch me moment, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, to switch gears to close here, because you have written an actual book in addition to all of the advice.
I have written an actual book.
So on the writing side of things, what advice do you have for aspiring authors?
Well, this is my first book. It won't be my last. And I actually had to finish it between diagnosis and turning it into my publisher, which was a real doozy-woozy situation. I think my experience was a couple of things. I gave myself time. I set time. I made it a ritual. That's where I brought ritual into my life. I created ritual, turned off the noise, had a cup of coffee. I had a certain ritual that I had when I was really in the depths of writing. That was sort of about the writing process for me. That was really helpful. The other thing is I had been collecting this data for years. I had Word documents and social media graphics that I had just been trying out all of this over time. So it wasn't like I sat down to write from scratch, and none of us really do. We just sometimes don't have physical representations. So I gave myself permission to sort of cull all that I had put out in the world or put down in my own journals and things that I had learned. And then the third for me, and this might not apply to all kinds of books, but even when I write my next books, I think it will show up in the way, was every time I caught myself trying to speak in a voice that wasn't mine, speak in a like quote unquote professional voice, although I very much bring my professional lens, or speak in a researcher voice or an expert voice instead of my voice, which is my authentic voice. I'm showing up as your wise best friend is sort of the mantra I kept thinking about. And that was really important to me. I would call myself, because I would get stuck when I was trying to be somebody else, when I was trying to be a different kind of writer. And I would just be like, that's not the book that I'm writing. I just can't write that book. That's for somebody else to write. So coming back over and over again to like, is this something Lisa would say? Is this a Lisa voice? And that took some courage, because there was definitely some imposter syndrome, as every author has ever had in the history of writing, probably. But it was a really meaningful. And when I narrated my book, because it's an audiobook as well, and could read it and really read it out loud for the first time after reading a million iterations of the book over time, I felt so proud and reminded that I really was able to bring my, in that case, literal, but metaphorical voice. And for me, that was most important, because really this book in particular, I wanted, if you don't have somebody in your life who's grief literate, who knows how to support you, I wanted you to feel like you have me. And you can come back to these pages over and over again and feel like somebody gets you wherever you're at. And that, as a writer, was, just such a gift and such a profound thing to do. Yeah.
I love that. That's so nice. It's so comforting. And I just know that there's somebody out there who just took a deep breath, knowing that you were out there for them. I mean, it's really a gift. Anyway, Lisa, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I know we didn't even get to a lot of your subsequent losses and all the things in life that happened since, but
if you just guys have to read the book, or maybe we'll have another conversation another day.
Well, thank you so much for being just of service to so many other people.
Oh, thank you, Zibby, for having me and for this conversation. It was wonderful.
Welcome. All right. Have a great week.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you love it, please leave a review and follow us on social at Zibby Owens and at Zibby Readers.